So we now know what scales are, and we know what chromatic and diatonic means, right? So let's talk about our first scale. The first scale we're going to talk about right now is kind of the easiest one. The easiest one when it comes to understanding how scales work. And that is the chromatic scale. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on the chromatic scale because it's not really going to be hugely useful to us for a long time. But it does do a really good job of explaining to us what scales are. So the chromatic scale is every single note we've got. So let me pull up my piano keyboard here. Oops. There we go. So I'm going to start. The thing about the chromatic scale is you can start anywhere. Well, I guess you could say that's kind of true of major and minor scales also, but more on that shortly. I'm going to start on C here. So I'm going to enter the notes as I type. So if you're wondering how to do that in MuseScore, hit this little N and then hit keys on this keyboard and they will get entered up here. So here's a C, right? So in the chromatic scale, it is all possible notes. So here's C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, and C. There we go. Let's scroll back and have a look at that whole thing. Let's turn that off so we can see a little bit better. There we are. There is the chromatic scale from C to C. It is every single note, right? Now, the reason this is important is because we're about to start talking about major scales. And what major scales are, actually, what any other kind of scale is the chromatic scale where we're going to leave off some notes in a way that makes a pattern. So for the major scale, we're going to leave off this note, this note, this note, this note, and this note. And then we end up with a major scale. Now, don't worry about what I just said. I'm going to clarify how that exactly works in the next video when we start talking about major scales. I just want to point out here that the chromatic scale is all the notes. The major scale and minor scale and all the other kinds of scales are the chromatic scale with some notes left out. Okay? So keep that in mind. When you do a chromatic scale, you play everything, all possible notes. When you do a major scale, there's a pattern to the notes. And that's what we're going to talk about next. And that's like a really key thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about scales, is think about them as a pattern. There's a fairly simple way to remember the pattern in terms of whole steps and half steps. And we're going to talk about that right now. Why beat around the bush? Let's just dive right in. So let's jump over to the next section and start talking about major scales, and we'll go right into that pattern of major scales.